For 2012, our marquee event is this evening's program, which we are going to begin with a performance of a traditional South African gumboot dance by the Taratibu Youth Association of Mount Rainier, Maryland, who will simultaneously sing as an a cappella group a traditional South African work song, Shosholoza, and a spiritual song, Yonolo Pata. Ladies and gentlemen, the Taratibu Youth Association troupe. David, will you please stand and be acknowledged? David, very good. Actually, David, just come up here for a minute. Just come up here. Yeah. I'm also calling up the next person, so I'd like you both up here. And the man whom you just saw present the traditional NPC coffee mug to President Mandela, Gil Klein. The 1994 President of the National Press Club. Gil, could you just step up to the microphone, please? David contacted me as soon as he heard about it. He still has one of his proudest mementos of that day, showing him and Gil Klein with Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela has not aged. These two a little bit. Gil, in 2 minutes, we're on a tight schedule. Can you recall for everyone here what that day was like? As NPC president, you would have hosted many guest speakers that year. What are your memories of President Mandela's appearance, and how does that day fit into your own long and distinguished career as a journalist? And you do have a distinguished career. He was concerned whether I should use that adjective. Please, Gil.
Thank you very much, Myron. Two things stand out about that day. First of all, October 7th, the speaker that was lined up for that day was Peter Lynch, the tycoon of Wall Street. And I had 300 people for a financial writers conference ready to come here to hear him. And then I got a call from the South African Embassy. Would you please have Nelson Mandela speak on October 7th at lunch? And I said, how about breakfast? No. How about dinner? No. Okay. This is the only day in the history of the National Press Club, thousands of speeches, that we had 2 in one day. I arranged the staff. I was going, you're going to do what? I moved Peter Lynch to the Hotel Washington, got Nelson Mandela in here, packed house, 425 people in the balconies, hanging off the balconies. And Peter Lynch got 300 or more people over there. So it was the biggest day for the National Press Club lunches, and I don't think it'll ever happen again. Anyway, the other thing I remember is that everybody wanted a piece of Nelson Mandela. This was the biggest thing of the year, biggest name of the 1990s. And it was bedlam in the next door in the main lounge for the reception. Everybody wanted to get in. My poor assistant had to kind of play linebacker trying to keep people out. Everybody had things they wanted to present to him. And what I remember most about Nelson Mandela was his inner peace, his perfect calmness. It was turmoil all around him. It didn't bother him. And that was when I realized that a man who could spend 30 years in prison and come out and not be seeking revenge. It was the inner peace of Nelson Mandela that made him a great man. And that's what I remember. And Myron's back to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, His Excellency Ebrahim Rasool, the Ambassador of the Republic of South Africa to the United States. Born in 1962, that's my research, I hope it's correct. Born in 1962, the same year that Nelson Mandela was arrested and convicted of sabotage and other charges and sentenced to life imprisonment, Ebrahim Rasool has a long history of involvement in the anti-apartheid struggle, starting at high school and including leadership in the United Democratic Front and the African National Congress. He himself has spent time in prison and being under house arrest. Ebrahim Rasool has built up extensive experience in government, having led many departments, including health, welfare, finance, and economic development. As Premier of the Western Cape, he was instrumental in attracting foreign investment into the province. He has been ambassador to Washington since August 2010. We are pleased to welcome Ambassador Rasool as our keynote speaker this evening. Thank you. And I have one more sentence. And in doing so, I would like to thank the ambassador and his staff for their enthusiastic support and encouragement to this evening's program. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Myron Belkent, and thank you very much to the National Press Club for this extraordinary South African evening to celebrate the life, legacy, and values of Nelson Mandela. I think that it is a reunion of sorts in many ways. I remember the dark emergency in 1986, when in 1987 I went to prison for my second time, and our lawyers had tried to appeal, amongst others, to the Ambassador of the United States, who happened to be the first black ambassador, Edward Perkins. And thank you very much. And courageous journalism by people like Philip van Niekerk in what became the Mail and Guardian. I think it still sets the standards for bravery in journalism. It sets the bar for what is mischief in journalism and what is really true, courageous reporting on what happens, because the costs were just so many to be on the other side of the line. And so I think it's wonderful that that you're here. And then Charlene Smith, who I think has in the last few months taken the US by storm with her writing, with her enthusiasm for South Africa, and really in this seminal year making South Africa resound across the USA. Myron, you're right, in 1962 I was born as Nelson Mandela started his term in prison. In 1976 I went to high school and got caught up in the uprisings of the students, and then learned for the first time the name Nelson Mandela. It was in 1987 when I met Nelson Mandela for the first time, when a warden told me that I was ill, which evidently I wasn't, but it was his way of getting me into the same hospital waiting room at Pollsmoor Prison. And inside it was only Nelson Mandela and myself. And we had 10 minutes together. I just, incidentally, he was very worried about the young political detainees who were with me, and said, you know, I get a movie every Friday night. I'll insist with the wardens that he sends it to all of you to watch it on the Saturday night with my projector. We thought we were going to watch Police Academy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And we ended up watching with Nelson Mandela 12 episodes of a series called The Peopling of America. The history of the Native Americans the slave history, where the Irish came from and where they settled, when the Italians came, when the Dutch came, and how it became a united nation. I think that in 1990, I had the opportunity to travel with him through Africa as he went through 13 countries, and I happened to ask him, what was the thing about watching that? And he was very aware of the fact that we were needing to unite our people, and we needed to learn from countries like the United States about how that was done. It was in 1994 that I understood that he had a unique contribution not only to South Africa, but to the world. And it was a unique contribution that was based on both that inner calm, but a radiating philosophy, a philosophy that we call Ubuntu, that in the words of Nelson Mandela says, I am because you are. That establishes not the independence of people, but the interdependence of people. Not the disconnectedness of people, but the interconnectedness of people. That we are people through other people. We do have responsibilities to each other and rights over each other, even while we are unique human beings ourselves. And so that really was one of the striking ways in which Nelson Mandela shaped South Africa's history and made an impact on the world. Just to continue with the dates, it was in 2006 when I was Premier or Governor of the Western Cape, and I had a visitor, an unknown senator from Illinois, who came visiting South Africa. Not many doors, political doors opened for him. I was one of 2 politicians who made time for him, spent 2.5 hours with him, and gave him one of the original lithographs of Nelson Mandela's first speech as a gift. When I presented my credentials to then President Obama, I reminded him of this picture, and he sent one of his guards out to ask me about the description of it, because he was sure they had not brought it to the White House yet. I hope they have since, and especially now that he knows he's got the White House for another 4 years, he can decorate it. But this philosophy that Nelson Mandela lived by requires, unlike what we sometimes encounter in conversations, whether you're watching those conversations in the USA or whether you're participating in those conversations, it requires not that you hold on to your autonomy, but you understand that you cede some of your autonomy, both as a person and as a group and as a community. That you sacrifice some of your individuality to build community. That you must admit a degree of fragility and vulnerability in order to allow others also into your life, and to be able to see the vulnerability and the fragility of others as well. And that's the basis of a great empathy that transcends everything that you stand for, everywhere that you come from, and the people that you call your community. And it's only that can shape the kind of insights that Nelson Mandela shared with us, both when he spoke to the Press Club here in 1994, as well as the story of the Rugby World Cup. And it is that I think makes us fairly unique as we go forward. You see, when we all have bonds, but those bonds that we have comes easily in a family, because we know every dream and help its realization of every other family member. We know every fear of every family member, and we help them overcome it. It's very easy to have bonds within a community of people who look like you, think like you, talk like you, eat like you, pray like you, and do the things that you generally do. Because you share a heritage, you all know where you come from, and you share values which you express in your rituals, your culture, and your cuisine, and everything else. And so those bonds are the easy ones. But what do you do when you encounter the stranger? What do you do when you encounter the other? What do you do when, like Nelson Mandela, you encounter the enemy? Those who don't look like you, who don't pray like you, who don't think like you. What do you do when you confront them? When you don't know their dreams and their fears? When you don't share their heritage and their values? It's then to see behind them, within them, and beyond them. And that was the great contribution of Nelson Mandela, because Ubuntu is not just the way in which you are perceived. It is the way you also see others. It is the way you relate to others. Because then you have not sight, but insight. That's when you see that behind the aggression of those who have oppressed you may actually lie a deep fear of the unknown. Behind their arrogance may be a great vulnerability. Behind their military might is a great uncertainty. Behind their over-assertive religiosity is a deep spiritual vacuum. And he did not make a mistake of speaking to the aggression, to speaking to the arrogance, of speaking to the religiosity, of speaking to their might. If he did speak to all of those things that presented themselves on the surface, he would be, in his own words, a hostage to them. Because there's no way you can speak the language of arrogance, hostility, and all of those kind of things. Instead, he understood the need to address their fears, their vulnerability, their uncertainties, and their vacuum that they carry with them. And in his own words, he says, I wanted South Africa to see that I loved even my enemies while I hated the system that turned us against each other. And that is the deep spiritual wisdom. How do you make a distinction between a people who do certain things and the system that they represent? And that's his unique contribution. And this was at the heart of that profound transition in South Africa. Now, sometimes when people don't understand how you can do something so counter-instinctive, so counterintuitive, unexpected, surprising, we call it a miracle, as so many people do. And Nelson Mandela would be the last to say that what he lived through and what he led was a miracle. Because the moment we admit that it was a miracle, we cede it to the realm of the divine, and we take it out of the realm of the human. Because what we are here to assert in celebrating the life, legacy, and values of Nelson Mandela is that it is human. It may have been divinely inspired, but it was human action and human agency. Most importantly, that it can be done. That's not something for someone else to do. That's not something for a great soul. That's why we don't sanctify Nelson Mandela. We don't admit him to the realm of the saints, because we want him to be emulated. And that's what the celebration of his life, legacy, and values are about. It's to be able to see the chasm in the US conversation and to say, you can overcome it. That we bring to you Nelson Mandela, who had more cause to be angry, but forgave. There are some people who have less cause to be angry, but hold it against their brothers, hold it against their children, hold it against their neighbors, hold it against their colleagues at work, hold it against people in other parties. They have less cause to be angry, and yet they grab it so easily. And we want to show, here's someone who had greater cause, the greatest cause, and transcended it. Here was someone who, if anyone was a victim of a system, it was Nelson Mandela. And yet he eschewed. He turned his back on victimhood because he knows that victims can't lead, because they are led by their emotions. The moment a community internalizes that victimhood, they have given up agency. And Nelson Mandela absolutely refused to give up agency. In his own words, he says that the one thing they couldn't take away from me was my heart and soul. I gave them everything else, but I kept that to myself, because he knew that it was that heart and soul that was free even in prison. And that the moment he filled it, either with victimhood, or with vengeance, or with fear, or with hatred, that he would have given away his own heart and soul. And that's what we come not only to celebrate, But that's what we come to commend in a place like the United States of America, and part of our diplomacy of Ubuntu, the diplomacy of people who are people through other people. And it was that transition to a democratic, free, non-racial and non-sexist South Africa, it was out of that it was born. And we made a unique exchange through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where we exchanged truth for reconciliation. It wasn't a free pass. It was the ability to even admit to the worst crime that was possible. And if your honesty and your integrity was put on the line for confessing and telling us the truth, what you got in exchange was reconciliation. It's a major thing to give. It was a unique inversion of strengths and weaknesses. In the world today, the word compromise is a denotion of weakness. The word compromise is seen as a dirty word because weak people compromise. Strong people stand by their own positions. And it was Nelson Mandela who understood that the intersection of justice and peace was compromise. Because an unmitigated striving for justice often has to be at the expense of peace. Because it's an unrelenting struggle to establish justice altogether and everywhere. But at the same time, a meek search for peace compromises justice necessarily. And therefore, how do you find sufficient peace and sufficient justice? Through compromise, in order for you eventually to aggregate it and to build up a society based on both as you achieve it progressively. We can have many debates about how quickly we're achieving it, how fully we're achieving it today. That's really what the debate has to be about whether the compact that led us to that intersection 18 years ago, whether it is holding. I think we also gave greater depth to notions of justice, because we could have spoken about absolute justice in the form of Nuremberg. But we knew that that absolute justice is the justice of the victor. Only when you have won and vanquished your enemy can you impose that. What we needed was transitional justice. Justice that took us from where we were to where we wanted to be. What we needed was restorative justice. Justice that systematically over time restored dignity, restored material goods, and restored our country to something great. Most importantly, Nelson Mandela gave us the ingredients to build a middle ground, because what we needed was to avoid the extremes. Because in situations of conflict, it's easy for everyone to flee to the extremes and abandon the middle ground. And we live in a world of binaries today, with us or against us and them. And it's especially in such contexts that we need those lessons from Nelson Mandela about how to establish a middle ground, how to build a consensus in the center and avoid those extremes. How do we isolate, in fact, and minimize those extremes? How do we grow and strengthen that middle ground? That middle ground today in the world is endangered and it's rare. And it is that middle ground that sees the extremes being ascendant, the ideological binaries that are growing by the day, the religious fundamentalisms that are asserting themselves every day, the intolerant politics that we get caught up in every day. And they all speak to a very deep uncertainty that human beings live with in a world that isn't the same as it was, that is being reshaped by globalism, that has been, in a sense, given a surfeit of information, a surfeit of knowledge, technology, and all of those kind of things, where our faith communities, for example, are not always able to make sense of their role in the world today, because one of the first victims of greater knowledge is sometimes faith. That one of the great victims of pervasive technology that brings you ICTs on every device that you have is culture. And all the certainties that we held yesterday are held up for scrutiny today. And so, as Professor J.K. Galbraith, that Canadian-born American economist, once said, the more uncertain people are, the more dogmatic they become. The more uncertain people are, the more dogmatic they become. And that's the world we live in. A world of competing and rivaling dogmas, which doesn't speak of the certainty of those who propound those dogmas, but speak about the great uncertainty, the great fragility, the great vulnerability at the heart of what they purport to believe. And this is the time when we need someone like Nelson Mandela, who is able to put his own doubts on the table in order to invite you to express your doubts. One of the memorable quotes of Nelson Mandela is when he says, none of us can be described as having virtues or qualities that raise him or her above others. Imagine someone who leads a 100-year-old movement, who has come out of prison and now needs to reshape his country, admitting that we can't speak about us having virtues and qualities that raise us above others. Who else in today's world would admit to that? At the moment you say those kind of things, that's the moment when you invite others to express their vulnerabilities. That's where leadership differs from simply being a manager. And how do we lead in this? And so the challenge today is that Nelson Mandela taught us in South Africa, that I think the world needs, is how do we re-establish balance in the world? How do we have sufficient certainty to know who we are and to be anchored in certain core values, but at the same time have sufficient doubt to prevent arrogance, intolerance, and blind faith? How do we balance that? How do we have all the joys of our own communities, enjoying our identity, enjoying the anchors in our life, enjoying the feeling of being at home amongst those who are like us, but to know at the same time that we are not complete when we enter into relationships with people who are diverse, who are different, who are other than us. They complete us, because what we have in our community can never be complete. How do we become passionate about our causes, our issues, and our campaigns, but at the same time always search for the underlying values and principles between what we hold dear and what others hold dear, even if it is in other campaigns, other issues, and other causes? It is in such things that Nelson Mandela could transcend his own party, his own community, his own tribe, and therefore embrace his enemy. It is in such things that we understand that a declaration of non-racialism meant actually sharing government with whites, with the National Party, and with those who imprisoned him. Because Nelson Mandela understood something that is not always understood in the world today, that when you proclaim moral ends, you must have moral means. You can't fight for non-racialism and mobilize racially. You can't fight for justice but oppress women. And so we can show that there are many struggles who are defied, not by their ideals, but by their contradictory methodologies towards those ideals. And that is why someone like Nelson Mandela has always understood how to find a balance, that he was the founding commander of the ANC's guerrilla army, but never wallowed in violence and was never a warmonger. At the same time, he initiated negotiations with the National Party, but no one would accuse him of being a pacifist. It is being elusive about those things that create leadership. And so I think that building a middle ground requires leadership, while being on the extremes requires demagoguery. And we've got to be able to distinguish between the two. And we've got to reappropriate language in today's world. Because for me, and in the Kantian approach to life, courage is not the opposite of cowardice. The opposite of cowardice is recklessness. Courage is the middle. It's to have enough caution, but enough resolve at the same time. That's what courage is. In much the same way, the opposite of war is not peace. The opposite of war is passivity. Peace is the perfect middle between the two, because peace is, like Nelson Mandela, the ability to fight for the things you believe in, but to be ready to withdraw and to speak and to dialogue when the conditions are there for it. And the question for us is, how do we become advocates of those? And so when the South African Embassy, with partners like the National Press Club, come together to celebrate the life, legacy and values of Nelson Mandela, we see this as the important plank of the diplomacy of Ubuntu that South Africa must be able to stand for in a very troubled world. That it cannot simply be to do the usual. It has to be to do the unusual. The memorable line from Invictus is when Nelson Mandela tells his comrades, "Let us surprise them with our generosity." We have forgotten the art of surprising with our generosity. And that, I believe, is Nelson Mandela's greatest gift to the world, so that generosity is not a weakness, but becomes the ultimate strength that people are capable of having. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Edward Perkins, my immediate left, has had a very distinguished career in the United States State Department, starting in 1972, rising through the Foreign Service ranks to become Director of the State Department's Office of West African Affairs from 1983 to 1985, then Ambassador to Liberia in 1985, and the following year, he became the first ever black ambassador named by the United States to South Africa, where he served for 3 years until 1989. It was, as you can imagine, a momentous period leading up to the end of apartheid and the freeing of Nelson Mandela in 1990. And as challenging as that assignment was, Ambassador Perkins went on to serve as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations from 1992 to 3, and then Ambassador to Australia from 1993 to 1996, when he retired with the rank of Career Minister in the U.S. Foreign Service. Ambassador Perkins is the William J. Crowe. He was ambassador to the United Kingdom when I was there, and he was a great Oklahoman,
yeah, right.
just like you. Ambassador Perkins is the William J. Crowe Professor Emeritus and former Senior Vice Provost who helped build the new School of International Studies at Oklahoma University. I know the Press Club has a tradition of many outstanding members from Oklahoma. He has a book entitled Mr. Ambassador, Warrior for Peace, which covers the period of his appointment in South Africa. We are truly honored to have Ambassador Edward Perkins open this panel discussion with his insight into that difficult and sensitive period in South Africa from 1986 to 1989, and what role the United States played in the move toward the end of apartheid and the freeing of Nelson Mandela.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. A wonderful address. As I found many South Africans do that very well. And you're carrying on the tradition. First, I'd like to say that at Ellis Stadium, I met with the first secret group of South Africans, whites, coloreds, and blacks, who were secretly plotting to get rid of apartheid inside South Africa. But the government had a secret police force. They found out about it. And the following Sunday, I got a call from the foreign minister. He said, Mr. Ambassador, did you have a meeting at the stadium such and such a day? I said, yes, I did. Who did you meet with? I was just there. It's one of your national places. I go and make my acquaintance known. He said, well, did you talk about politics? I said, I don't think I have to tell you what I talked about. He said, well, would you give a statement to the press saying that you didn't talk about anything about getting rid of apartheid? I said, Foreign Minister, you know I can't say that. So you know why I'm here. He said, well, Mr. Ambassador, you have to be careful what you do in South Africa. South Africa left me a changed person. I will never be the same as a result of that assignment. I think it would be important for me to say when I first got there, I asked to see Nelson Mandela in jail. His keeper was the Minister of Justice, Justice Minister Kobe Kutsia at that time. And I said, well, Mr. Minister, I have to see Nelson Mandela. I have to go to jail to see him. He said, well, it's not quite time. I said, listen, every time I ask to see him, he will become a little bit more powerful in jail. He said, oh, come on, man. That's not true. Shortly thereafter, Winnie Mandela came to see me and said, my husband wants you to continue asking to see him. He said me to tell you, as long as you ask that question, he gets a little more powerful in jail. When Nelson Mandela came out of jail, and when I first met him, he hugged me, and then he said, Mr. Ambassador, I want you to know I'm looking forward, not backwards. And that's his legacy. That's what the ambassador was talking about here. I think it would be instructive to all of us, and certainly to me, again, to take about 2 minutes and talk about my appointment to South Africa as the ambassador of the United States. In 1985, a lot of heat was being generated in this country. Demonstrations were going on. The Free South Africa movement finally got the attention of the Reagan administration. And finally, it became clear that something had to be done of some momentousness. One of his advisors said, maybe we just appoint a black ambassador. That should satisfy everybody. The only difference was that they had in mind a non-career ambassador, someone who would be friendly towards the Reagan administration at that time. Some of you who followed it may know that up to that time, the Reagan administration had pursued a policy called constructive engagement. It didn't work. And the public at large wanted a change. They wanted the administration to have a change. They wanted our country to be standing on the right side of history. George Shultz, who was Secretary of State, told me later, he went to the president and said, it is time to send a black ambassador, but we've got to find someone that we can send and give him the authority of a proconsul, someone who can make decisions at the embassy in Pretoria or in Cape Town and not ask us what to do. Let me find someone who can meet that qualification. And I had not heard about this. And one night went to bed where I was in Liberia. My wife woke me up about 12 o'clock and said, I just saw your name and picture on TV. I said, what was it about? She said, it's about being ambassador to South Africa. I said, I've never been to South Africa. I've don't know anything about it. And nobody in his right mind is going to ask me to go to South Africa. The next morning, I went to work, and the Assistant Secretary for South African Affairs, Chet Crocker, called me and said, I guess you've seen the speculation about you going to South Africa. I said, I have. He said, pay no attention to it. It's not going to happen. I said, thank you very much. And I went back to work. The next morning, I got a call from the Secretary of State, George Shultz. He said the same thing. I guess you've seen the speculation about you going to South Africa. I said, yes, I have. He said, well, it's true. I said, Mr. Secretary, I don't quite understand that. He said, well, here's the way we're going. He said, I've asked the President to let me find a black Foreign Service officer who can go to South Africa and maybe help make a difference in changing our policy and bringing about the end of apartheid. And I've asked for 3 lists of people. Every time I get a list, your name is on it. So I'd like for you to let me send your name over to the President as the person he should nominate to be the next ambassador to South Africa. I said, well, I can't ask you now. I have to talk about it. He said, I know you have to talk about it. Only one person you can talk to, and that's your wife. So I asked Lucy the next day, and she said, what was the oath of office you took when you became a member of the United States Foreign Service? I said, to go where needed, when needed. She said, maybe this is the time. I called the secretary back and told him I would go. He said, I heard you were that kind of a person. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm not sure what he meant by that. However, shortly after he talked to me, I got a secret cable to return to Washington immediately, but to do it silently and not let anybody know I was there. So I got the manager of Pan American Airlines at that time to put me on the plane secretly and go back to Washington. When I got to Reagan National Airport, I saw a sign in the airport saying Ambassador Perkins, which meant that somebody wanted to speak to me. But also it was a trick by the press to catch me. So I kept going. Let me tell you what happened with the president. I think it's, I want to say it because our country is based on the concept of the freedom of the individual. No country gets that way overnight. We grow into it. And it's true with our country as well, the United States. So when the president sent word he wanted to see me one Saturday morning, no one to come with me. He brought me into the White House through a secret entrance, and I went to the war room, the area where he used to meet with, where Lincoln used to meet with his generals during the Civil War. He was accompanied by his chief of staff and the head of the National Security Council. And I was in the room alone, and I was thinking, what am I doing here? About that moment, President Reagan strolled in cowboy clothes, getting ready to go to Camp David. He breezed over to me and he said, Mr. Ambassador, I'm Ronald Reagan. Thank you for coming to my house. He said, the subject this morning is South Africa. George, meaning George Shultz, wants me to send you to South Africa. That is, he wants me to send your name to the Senate as the next nominee for South Africa. And I understand you will go if I say I want to send you. I said, yes. He said, if I do send you, what are you going to do? I'd like to tell you that I reeled off a set of things, but I was completely blown out of my mind. I didn't know what to say. So I said the first thing that came to me. I said, well, Mr. President, South Africans believe that your administration is hostile to black people in South Africa, and that the United States doesn't care anything about them. I said, if you send me, I'll try to change that view. And I'll try to use the power of your office to bring about change in South Africa. He said, really? How are you going to do that? I said, I will try to get to know all South Africans. And he said, will you get to know the whites as well? I said, yes, I will, because they have a role to play in South Africa. Then he said, what do you think black people in this country will think of you for taking this kind of assignment from me, Ronald Reagan? I said, I don't know. He said, well, they won't like it. So if I send you, you will have to travel around this country before you go, meet as many black leaders as you can, tell them what you just told me, tell them what you're going to do in South Africa, because if you make any difference whatsoever, you're going to need their help. And then he said, after an hour, well, thanks for coming, I'll let you know. He walked to the door, and then he turned around. He came back over and he said, you know, Mr. Ambassador, I think you're the man to go. I want you to go. Don't say anything to anybody. I'll make the announcement in my own way. Thank you very much for agreeing to go. And off the door we went. So I went back to the place where I was staying with my daughter, who was in graduate school here. And I didn't say anything. She said, what's the matter, Dad? I said, I don't know. Something is... something that just happened to be. I didn't think it would ever happen. And I told her about the meeting with President Reagan. And she said, well, the one thing you'll have the Perkins family behind you. And that's all she said. And so I sat and had a drink and tried to go to sleep, and I couldn't. I thought about it all the way. The reason I tell this story is the ambassador talked about what makes great countries. And he put a burden on this country, the United States of America, as being a model. It is a model as long as we continue to change, continue to make the issues that we stand for stand out for everybody around the world. And I think this time, when the president sent me to South Africa with proconsul powers to make policy in South Africa and not refer it to the United States, that was a time when he said, America is going to stand up tall and make a difference. Well, we did make a difference in South Africa. We allied ourselves with all the forces fighting for freedom in South Africa. The ANC, the United Front, many others in South Africa, who taught me so much about myself and about human dignity. So South Africa is a teacher of many lessons. And Nelson Mandela, I am the better person for having met him, certainly the better person for having gone to South Africa and represented the United States of America. Thank you.
Charlene Smith is an award-winning South African-born journalist who has written 2 authorized biographies of Nelson Mandela. Mandela, A Celebration of a Great Life, and Mandela and America, both of which will be available for purchase and which the author will be pleased to sign at the reception afterwards if any of you wish to obtain copies. And I know some of you have asked me about that when you came in and saw the books. Ms. Smith specializes in politics, economics, gender, and HIV and AIDS issues. The author of 14 books, including her 2 authorized biographies of Nelson Mandela, she has also made 4 television documentaries of Nelson Mandela, including an award-winning documentary for Canadian broadcasting. She's also worked for CBS 60 Minutes, ABC Nightline, and others. We are so pleased that you traveled from your home in Boston to be with us tonight. Ms. Smith will carry on the theme of Ambassador Perkins' remarks and speak on Mandela and America.
how a peaceful settlement may not have been achieved, in her words, without the U.S. passing sanctions legislation in 1986, and the importance of the ongoing relationship between the United States and South Africa.
Thank you, Myron. Most of all, I'm pleased that he didn't give my date of birth as he did with the ambassador. I've been worried about that ever since. I think that one of the things that's really interesting, if you look at this panel, both Philip and I are white South Africans, and I think that tells you a lot about South Africa and how deeply we feel about this policy of non-racialism. We actually feel it and we believe it. And I'm always interested when journalists travel from the United States to other countries, and they're always looking for the race story. And I quite frankly think that the best race relations in the world at present are in South Africa. And I wonder very often when they write those stories where they've been in their countries in terms of looking at race relations, because I really think that we love each other. I'm going to read some of my notes, and I'm going to put on my glasses, which gives you an idea of how old I am. In 1985, I was working for Canadian Broadcasting, which was doing a special series on South Africa. The country was a mess. The military patrolled townships and kicked down the doors of residents to search for terrorists. It was clear that government-sponsored death squads were operating, and little did I know then that only 4 years later, Archbishop Desmond Tutu and others would ask me to become the first person to investigate those death squads. And that was work that later led to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was harrowing work at that stage. But in 1985, reconciliation was on no one's mind, no one except for one person who sat in a prison cell and approached the government to start discussing a negotiated settlement. It was through him, through Nelson Mandela, that we learned that those who shout loudest are often the weakest. It is the quiet listener who will first find a way, and weapons rarely win wars. It is personal courage, and I was interested when the ambassador referred to courage, because courage comes from the French word for heart, which means courage comes from the heart. And I think that history also comes from the heart. It comes from the heart of those who later become great. It is personal courage that allows the sacrifice and compromise that creates the greatest victories. It is those who suffer who most often become the peacemakers. We must remember too that not even the greatest are without flaw. Mandela says, "Judge me not on how high I have risen, but on how often I have fallen and risen again." He believes that failure is essential, because if we never fail, how will we see the obstacles that stand before us? We're simply not going to see them. When everything comes too easily, we won't anticipate the obstacles that will one day block our way. And so in 1985, as angry mobs placed burning tires around the necks of those they believed to be informers, and as we journalists spent every weekend attending the funerals of activists, President Ronald Reagan was still prepared to give South Africa yet another chance in his desire to protect the precious metals of South Africa. In that year, the media descended on South Africa to hear Prime Minister P.W. Botha cross the Rubicon, or so we thought, in a much-touted speech. I'll never forget reading that speech an hour before he delivered it, and panic-stricken, because I was on deadline for CBC, rereading it again, because he'd just shown 2 fingers to the world, and then ensured that in that year, more than 48,000 people landed up in apartheid jails, almost half of them children, some as young as 6 years old. One of the things that they would do in those days, particularly 1986, which was a really dreadful year, was to punish activist communities. What they would do is, if the parents were activists, if there was There was a community called Kagiso near Johannesburg that was very active as an example. I can see you remembered, Ambassador. And what they did to punish the parents is they went in and they detained the children. Some as young as 6 years old. And I wonder if you would resist injustice if it meant it placed your partner and your children at risk. Most of us would say that we wouldn't. And yet in South Africa, many did, including Nelson Mandela. And that has been his biggest burden, because when he went to jail in 1963, he never knew how brutal apartheid would become. Years later, while he sat in relative comfort in his small book-lined cell, police were harassing his wife. On one occasion, they arrested Winnie and forced her to spend the next 18 months in solitary confinement naked. She wasn't even allowed sanitary towels. And so when she had her monthly period, she wasn't allowed to wash the blood off for days, and so menstrual blood caked on her legs. Mandela was never tortured, but his family was. This became his biggest regret, the suffering of his family. And so every flaw he has today relates to his slowness to remonstrate with family members who dishonor the name Mandela. But in 1985, knowing the suffering of his family and thousands of others, he secretly approached the apartheid government seeking not his own release, but freedom for the nation. I was a reporter in the townships, and those were the worst years. I lost count of the bodies I saw, of the number of times I was arrested. That's one of the things that South Africans share. We all have a close acquaintanceship with jail cells. Those of us of a certain generation of the friends, and I can't remember how many friends have been tortured and killed. I can't describe our despair, but somehow the American people felt our pain. Thank God people then didn't believe change would come with an internet petition. The first call for sanctions was the 1961 joint call by the Reverend Martin Luther King and Chief Albert Luthuli, Mandela's leader in the ANC. It had limited success with the sports and weapons boycott a few years later. In 1976, Congress turned a deaf ear when Representative Ron Dellums called for sanctions after police opened fire on school children in Soweto. But in 1986, the American people heard. Representative William Gray of Pennsylvania authored CAAA, the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, and Senator Edward Kennedy and Senator Tom Harkin piloted it, defeating a presidential veto from Ronald Reagan. Many said that sanctions wouldn't work. And please remember that today when we're discussing other sanctions in other countries. Mostly those who put the interests of capital above those of people. In studies of Latin America during the dark years of the generals in the 1980s, one theme was consistent. No coup is ever successful unless big business or a foreign power supports it. In South Africa, we learned another lesson. When comprehensive sanctions are applied, big business goes banging on the doors of government and suddenly says, change the system. No one will buy our stocks. We can't sell exports. We can't import innovation. Democratize the political system. Do sanctions work? You bet your life they do. Within 5 years, Nelson Mandela walked free, and behind him were 40 million South Africans. Yes, repression intensified before debated. The week before democratic elections in 1994, I walked through a square where a bomb had detonated next to a taxi rank. There was an arm stuck to a wall, a head on a ledge. I stepped on bits of flesh about that big. There was nowhere to walk without stepping on the remains of someone's father, mother, friend, or lover. This was the price of freedom. But no foreign tanks rolled over our borders. No drones bombed our cities. This freedom, won in blood, was our freedom. We chose our leaders. They were not pre-selected by others. So every triumph was ours, and every failure we own too. Nelson Mandela held the nation together in those early years through 70% love and 30% hard talk. He loved us so hard, this nation of people that had carried such shame, that we began loving ourselves. And I think it's difficult to understand how much shame we carried. And so we began taking pride in ourselves. He loved us so much that when he spoke hard, we listened, we reformed. We so badly needed to be loved, to be better than our venal past had suggested we could be, that we reached out our hands to each other. We embraced, we apologized, we tried, we followed his example, we made friends of our enemies. Today I look at some of the failures in South Africa, and I feel that we have betrayed the promise of democracy, which we as South Africans see as a nation where the most humble have opportunity. We're less worried about the middle class than we are about the poor. When Nelson Mandela walked into a room, he would nod to the powerful, but first greet the most humble. The waiters pretending they were invisible in the back of the room, the cleaners peering through doorways. To Nelson Mandela, no one is invisible. Everyone is worthy. He particularly likes women, by the way. So he'll speak to us first. His legacy is twofold. First, if you make your enemy your friend, they will lead you to power greater than that which you can now imagine. Enemies limit your power, but when you have the courage and lack of self-defeating ego to reach out to them, some among them will support you. Secondly, those who make you powerful are the invisible people, those who are ignored when black limousines sweep by. A leader who stops to speak with the humble, with a real desire to hear and learn, is a leader who aspires to greatness, because it is the 7 billion meek of the world who hold the key to the kingdom, not the 1%. And what of South Africa today? I end a biography of Mandela with these words, reflecting on one of his last public speeches. He criticized growing poverty and joblessness. 1 million jobs had been lost. Unemployment was officially around 26%. But BMWs and Mercedes were still conspicuous by their prevalence on their roads. None of this would have surprised the documenter of democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville, who more than 2 centuries before observed that all revolutions enlarge the ambition of men. In this first burst of triumph, nothing seems impossible to anyone. Not only are desires boundless, but the power of satisfying them seems almost boundless too. Thus, at the moment when an aristocracy is dissolved, its spirit still pervades the mass of the community, and its tendencies are retained long after it has been defeated. A sense of instability remains. And we should think about these things when we look at the Middle East now as well. De Tocqueville said as well, desires still remain extremely enlarged when the means of satisfying them are diminished day by day. And in the book I wrote, perhaps the betrayal felt by so many who fought for liberation is misplaced. The harm of decades cannot be overturned in 2 decades. Yet still the failures burn holes in hearts. They sadden. Perhaps one could muse that Mandela's epitaph might be, I am because of others. I learned all that I know from the greatest minds and the humblest of souls. My dignity was denigrated, and through that I learned to walk tall with pride, because personal dignity is contained within the spirit. I listened to my enemies with my heart and not my ego, and from that learned how to manage their fears and build within them the confidence that overturned hatred and brought my people to freedom. I learned that true freedom is eternal duty in the protection and building of liberty.
Thank you, Charlene. Wow, this is an amazing evening, and we are very grateful to everybody. And Ambassador Rasool, I was speechless after your speech. And when everybody just stood with a spontaneous ovation, that in the middle of moving the podium around, I didn't get to say thank you so much. It was a powerful speech. People who know me know that I'm never at a loss for words, but when you finished speaking and everybody rose as one, there was nothing I could say except now, thank you. And thank you to our first two panelists, and I thank in advance our final panelist, Philip van Niekerk, was a journalist in South Africa for 2 decades, covering the critical last years of apartheid and the transition to democracy. He worked for the anti-apartheid Weekly Mail and became editor of the paper from 1996 to 2001, after it was transformed into the Mail and Guardian. He also worked as the Africa correspondent of a number of foreign publications, including the London Observer. In 2001, he moved to Washington to direct projects for the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. Today, he's the managing director of Calabar Africa, a strategic consulting company specializing in political analysis, investment support, and media affairs in Africa. Mr. van Niekerk will speak on Nelson Mandela, the strategist, the politician, and the leader, with a segue into some brief remarks about current leadership issues in South Africa. Philip, thank you for joining us tonight. I know you have a busy travel schedule, but the gods were good. Your presence in Washington coincided with tonight. We're very grateful.
Thank you. I was very struck in the video of Mr. Mandela's performance when he came and spoke at the press club here, his remarks about his support for a free press. And I just want to say that as a working journalist in South Africa, in the years, I guess, 1990, from the moment that he was released until 1999, when he exited after his first, he took one term and he decided, that's it, I'm going to show an example to the future, that we don't hang around until people want us to go. We leave when people still want us to stay. That my experience, in a very direct way, was that he was extremely supportive of a free press as a politician. On a personal level, in 1992, I was wounded in the townships. I was in hospital. I woke up the next morning. There was Nelson Mandela come to say, you know, we don't support the kind of behavior, and we're going to talk to people and, you know, basically prevent this kind of action against journalists, which we don't support. A couple of years later in Liberia, I got trapped in Monrovia in the middle of civil war. Mandela took time to help get me airlifted out. I wrote a letter to him after that, promising to stay out of trouble. But I'll tell you, when I was editor of the Mail and Guardian during the first term, during Mandela's first term, and we wrote a lot of stuff that the ANC didn't particularly like. As the ambassador might recall. And we were publicly, I remember one Friday morning, there were some, you know, press statements that were fairly critical about the story that had appeared that morning, and telephone rang and there was Mandela to say, we support what you're doing. You know, I back you entirely. And that's the, you know, I just want to give that kind of perspective in a very direct way. I also want to say that, you know, we've I guess heard a lot today about the kind of greatness and the generosity of spirit of Mandela, and the sense in which he, I guess, if we think about him and what he means to us, more than anything else, it's his ability to forgive. But having seen him very close at hand, I think one of the most, I think his real political genius was as a political strategist. I think it's an ability and understanding of power and how important power is, because when he was put in that little cell, tiny little cell in Robben Island, he was completely powerless. He had nothing. It was a very important moment in the history of the country. 1963, the real legitimate leadership of black South Africa was either in jail or in exile, and the kind of grand apartheid project was underway to create puppet leadership to run kind of fake countries called Bantustans, which the project being ultimately to dispossess black South Africans of their birthright as South African citizens. Therefore, it wasn't just that he was jailed because he was an opponent. He was jailed because it was necessary to get him out the way, marginalize him completely. So here's this guy, sits in his cell, they're doing hard labor. It was tough out there on Robben Island. It wasn't like anybody was having a holiday or a spa time. It was, you know, anybody who's read the stories about what those guys went through, it was horrendous. And Mandela sits there and he says, right, how do I start to get back? How do I start to kind of reclaim a little bit of power? So they have hunger strikes. They have sit-ins, they have demonstrations. And little by little, they win the right to get newspapers, to have visitations by relatives once a month, to see their lawyers. Every little inch of space that they win is a little bit more power. And even to the point where the National Party realizes, hey, we don't want Mandela to die in jail. We want to get him out of jail. We want to get rid of this problem that he's sitting there. But he understands that. He understands, you know, I have a weapon. You don't know what to do with me. You've got to figure out what you're going to do with me. So they say, all right, you can go to the Transkei. You know, his cousin, Kaiser Matanzima, was then head of the Bantustan Transkei. Said, you can get your freedom, you can go and live in the Transkei. He says, I'm not going to do it. He said, right, if you renounce the armed struggle, if you know, renounce the ANC, he says, I'm not going to do it. When Mandela walked free in February 1990, he walked out on his own terms. He'd switched the whole power thing around. They were begging him to come out. They were begging him. Believe me, that's not a small thing, because he then undertakes to negotiate the future of the country. And there was nothing actually certain about how that was going to end up. You know, they still had some plans that they were going to have, you know, white representation, and they were going to have shared government. There was something like the Lancaster House Agreement in Zimbabwe. Mandela was a tough negotiator. We think of him, you know, as a man who forgives people and who reconciles. I mean, I saw him take on F.W. de Klerk. I saw him blow up with anger and chastise him like he was a little boy. And de Klerk just, his ears went red. He was the president of the country. And Mandela had turned the table so completely that even before he actually became president, he was the man that people looked to provide the guidance and to provide the political leadership in the country. When Chris Hani was assassinated in 1993, I think it was the moment that South Africa came the closest to a revolution. You know, there was such anger. The people of South Africa were ready to rise up and just burn and attack because they felt so kind of betrayed by this assassination. It was Mandela, not de Klerk, not anybody in the National Party had so lost any ability to sort of speak to the people of South Africa. It was Mandela who appeared on television. And he said, you know, you've got to remember it was a white woman who spotted the assassins and allowed them to be arrested. You know, we have to calm down. We have to, let's not destroy our future now by exploding in anger. We know, I understand what you feel. And by speaking to people in that way, he showed the most incredible leadership. And actually, it was in Mandela, the palm of Mandela's hand, that we actually steered that country, because there was, at that time, also terrible third force violence going on, attacks on people in trains. The Boipatong squatter camp was attacked, women and children massacred, and there was a lot of anger. And Mandela just kept his eye on the ball. I think it was very good that you showed the extracts from Invictus, because you know, I think Invictus is a good film because it does, in fact, speak to Mandela's political genius. And it wasn't that in a cynical kind of way, I'm going to use sport. He actually loved sport. He was a boxer himself. You know, Charlie's book, in fact, has got a cover of him with Muhammad Ali. I mean, that was, for Mandela, that was a big moment, meeting Muhammad Ali. I mean, I'm sure it was a big moment for Muhammad Ali as well. But he genuinely loved sport. You know, and he genuinely loved people. I mean, he had that skill which probably Bill Clinton has. You know, that sort of, it's not just that you're schmoozing as a politician, it's that you genuinely are interested. You have that charm and that sense of kind of reaching out. And I saw it, in so many ways, that he changed people who you would have imagined would have hated. Were brought up to hate black people. And then there was Mandela. There was a guy who came once to put a carpet in our house, and we had a picture of Mandela on the wall. He said, "That man, this is an Afrikaner, blue collar Afrikaner guy who you would have expected would have hated Mandela." And I said, he said, that chap. We were fixing carpets once at the Elizabeth Hotel, which is opposite Shell House, where the ANC headquarters were. And all these ANC bigwigs came walking up the stairs and past us, and suddenly there's a tap on my shoulder, and there's Nelson Mandela. He's saying, "Well, how's the carpet business?" And that stayed with that man for the rest of his life. He was just converted by that moment. That ability to reach out to people is the thing, and it's not a cynical thing. And Mandela was there for 5 years. He understood that his role was simply to lead the country, to reconcile. His project was to create a unified South Africa, a miracle, rainbow nation, or whatever. Thabo Mbeki was his prime minister. Thabo Mbeki left the sort of economy and the sort of boring stuff, day-to-day running of the country. And then, as the biggest kind of gesture, he exited after 5 years to say, there's term limits on this whole thing. Now, a lot of people, if we read about South Africa in the newspapers today, we say, what has happened to the Mandela legacy? What has happened to this rainbow nation? There's The Economist running cover stories saying sad decline in South Africa. There's the Marikana slaughter people are seeing on television, black people strikers being gunned down by the police. Is this no different to what happened before 1994? And a lot of people are asking questions about, where's South Africa going? This great leadership kind of example was set at the very beginning, but where are we now? I just want to make just a few very brief comments about that. I think, first of all, it was always going to be hard to fill Mandela's shoes. And I think as much as Thabo Mbeki, I think it was very good for the economy. I think that South Africa was into a much more divisive phase in that period. Even the ANC to this day is sort of riven by factions, which I think are the legacy in many ways of the Mbeki era. Also, I think that there was a failure to a certain extent to understand that leadership isn't only about what you do now, and there was a lot of great leaders in the ANC in 1994. It's how we prepare for the future. And if anything, I think South Africa, after 1994, failed to grasp the nettle of education and changing the education system and political leadership. The ANC was very good at political leadership before 1994. I think afterwards, if you look at it now, if you still look at those who are contending, there's an ANC conference next month, you still look at those who are contending, they're all pre-94 people. Where's the next generation of leaders? Where's the next generation of Mandelas or Ramaphosa's? And I don't see enough of them coming on. But I think, finally, it's a crisis of expectations. And maybe, I won't say it's Mandela's fault, maybe it's because we as South Africans performed what was really, there's no other way to describe it, but as miraculous. There's the Palestinians and the Israelis still duking it out. Go to any other, the FARC and the Basques are still haven't settled. South Africa, actually, is an extremely normal society. South Africa might have issues, it might have problems, it might have challenges, but there's a feeling that, because it's South Africa, it's always got to work perfectly. Because it's the country of Mandela, it's always got to be better than everywhere else. But in fact, South Africa also has problems. South Africa also has issues. And I think it's almost a sort of a tribute to Mandela, that at the end of the day, if you take away, some of the more recent kind of events, if you take away the sort of the sheen of, underneath it all, South Africa is actually, it's a great country. It's a country that has mended itself, by and large. And the fact that we can even debate it in these terms, even talk about it in these terms, I think that's the greatest legacy of Mandela. It's never going to be, I mean, the United States of America has been over 200 years. You're never going to resolve all of your problems at one go. I think it's just a matter of saying, well, South Africa, let's have some more perspective. Let's understand that we actually can fail and maybe sometimes get it right and pick ourselves up. But I think that at the end of the day, you know, South Africa is a much better country, incredibly so, for Nelson Mandela.
Could I just, when a journalist writes a story, you're taught, make certain every sentence, every word is meaningful. Tonight, we have had, in addition to the videos, 4 speakers. Every word they said is so meaningful. I'm so grateful to all of them for being here tonight. We are on a tight schedule a bit because this program has been so fulsome that I need to leave time for the next phase of the program and the reception in the Holman Lounge and the appropriately named First Amendment Lounge. We have 2 things scheduled. We have a Q&A session scheduled. Unless somebody has a burning question, I'd like to suggest, and I'm committing the panelists to this, that those of you that have questions you'd like to ask individually, would you agree if they approach you during the reception? Is that okay? Sure. Okay, thank you. So as we move on, I'm just overwhelmed, and I can't say thank you enough to everybody, but we wanted to let you know about another aspect of South African life. And to conclude our celebration of the life, legacy, and values of Nelson Mandela, we invite you to sample some of his favorite food. Using recipes from Mandela's personal cook, the Press Club's executive chef, Susan Delbert, and her team in the kitchens of the Fourth Estate restaurant have rustled up a range of classic South African dishes that reflect the rich multi-heritage of the nation. Lamb sasatis, peri-peri chicken livers, pickled fish, and butternut squash soup.
I'll never go home.
And to go with these dishes, we have 2 other iconic South African delicacies. I want to get it right. Boerewors, which translates literally as farmer's sausage, and biltong, without which no South African braai or barbecue would be complete. And to complement the food, we are bringing a bit of South African to you with 2 examples of South Africa's excellent wine, the Sauvignon Blanc and the Syrah. And rather than I read you descriptions of each, there are descriptions on the various tables in the 2 rooms. We would like to thank Wines of South Africa, William Earl of the National Association of Beverage Importers for generously providing us with these wines. We also like to thank Brand South Africa and its U.S. country manager, longtime National Press Club member Simon Barber, for sponsoring the food. We will exit through these doors to the reception, but as we conclude the formal part of the program, I want to call on my colleague on the International Correspondence Committee, Jan de Plain, who has been working hard on putting together this program since she first messaged me during the summer, suggesting a South African night honoring the legacy of Nelson Mandela. As many of you know, whenever Jan de Plain comes up with one of her brilliant ideas, I simply say, yes, let's do it. And so before Jan takes the floor with her own remarks, I would like everyone to acknowledge all of her hard work as you just have done in putting together this evening's program.
Thank you. This has been a glorious evening. absolutely glorious evening. And of course, I love working with Myron. Because he says yes to me all the time. He says yes all the time. Rachel, are you listening? Anyway, it is so special. Ambassador, I love you so much. You are so great. And he always says to me, when I see you, Jan, I know I've got to do a different speech. You did a speech that was memorable. That was unbelievable. Anyway, and I look at each one of our panelists. I had no idea when we were selecting what we were going to have. Ambassador Perkins, I cannot tell you how impactful your story of sharing what that whole process was under President Reagan and how you came about to be the ambassador was just amazing, your time. And I'm glad you gave your wife, who I got to sit next to, your beautiful wife, so much acknowledgement for that. And Charlene and I have become best friends. We have been talking forever, and she came down here during the storm. You remember, we were all going to meet during the storm. She came down here, and we had to turn around and send her back, and I thought, do you think we're going to get her again? She came again. She was going to bring her daughter, but her daughter got sick tonight, and other things happened, which we won't go into, but she was here, and it was brilliant, and I want to get all your books and then some. And somebody said to me, are you her agent? And I thought, well, we'll discuss that afterwards. And Philip, you are absolutely the perfect one to have wrapped this up and tell us what the importance of Mandela, with the pluses and the minuses, and how America is great, South Africa is great, but we're not perfect. So thank you. That was absolutely brilliant. So again, I love Myron. He's the best chair for the International Correspondence Committee. I tell you, he is great. Anyway, and I just want to say we're going into the other room, and these delicious food that we're going to have, and South African wines. I mean, could we have given you a better evening, really? Did we do it or not? Again, to my volunteers, Sister Jenna, thank you for bringing the volunteers that you did with the Brahma Kumaris. Jerome, are you here? Jerome, for doing our video. Yay, Jerome. Thank you, dear. You made it. You did it. To Gloria Herndon, who just wave, Gloria, so we can see you, who's in Africa 90% of the time, and she will be putting together a special event this week honoring what will be the first woman to ever be the head of the African Union. And this is a big turning point for us women. And to Judith Terra, please wave your hand. Judith Terra, who is one of my dearest friends and who's the chair of the DC Commission on Arts and Humanities. She's our cultural czarina, and her husband, Dan Terra, was the first ambassador for cultural affairs in the State Department. We've never had one since. So thank you, Judith, for being here. And many of your others, I think, I see so many of you here, and Linda Green and Ambassador Dennis Antoine, and I guess others that have left. And last but not least, I'd like to recognize Tim Cox. Tim, will you wave, please? The chair of the Cultural Tourism DC, which has Passport DC every year, which is, be sure and wave, which the ambassador and South Africa has done every year. And last but not least, Annette Alantos, please wave your hand. It is Annette's husband who founded the Human Rights Congressional Committee, which is the only one we've ever had, and next to her is Nancy Rivard of Airline Ambassadors. So we have got a fabulous, you're not going afterwards, you're going straight into that room. There are 2 bars, so don't just stop at the first one, keep going on the other side, okay? And John Hardesty and his beautiful wife for coming here and doing the University Club's first event on South Africa. We followed in your footsteps. Thank you one and all, love you all, head on over there.
For that day was Peter Lynch, the tycoon of Wall Street. And I had 300 people for a financial writers conference ready to come here to hear him. And then I got a call from the South African Embassy. Would you please have Nelson Mandela speak on October 7th at lunch. And I said, how about breakfast? No. How about dinner? No. Okay. This is the only day in the history of the National Press Club, thousands of speeches, that we had 2 in one day. I arranged the staff who was going, you're going to do what? I moved Peter Lynch to the Hotel Washington, got Nelson Mandela in here, packed house, 425 people in the balconies, hanging off the balconies. And Peter Lynch got 300 or more people over there. So it was the biggest day for the National Press Club lunches, and I don't think it'll ever happen again. Anyway, the other thing I remember is that everybody wanted a piece of Nelson Mandela. This was the biggest thing of the year, biggest name of the 1990s. And it was bedlam in the next door in the main lounge for the reception. Everybody wanted to get in. My poor assistant had to kind of play linebacker trying to keep people out. Everybody had things they wanted to present to him. And what I remember most about Nelson Mandela was his inner peace, his perfect calmness. It was turmoil all around him. It didn't bother him. And that was when I realized that a man who could spend 30 years in prison and come out and not be seeking revenge, it was the inner peace of Nelson Mandela that made him a great man. And that's what I remember. And Myron's back to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, His Excellency Ebrahim Rasool, the Ambassador of the Republic of South Africa to the United States. Born in 1962, that's my research, I hope it's correct. Born in 1962, the same year that Nelson Mandela was arrested and convicted of sabotage and other charges and sentenced to life imprisonment, Ebrahim Rasool has a long history of involvement in the anti-apartheid struggle, starting at high school and including leadership in the United Democratic Front and the African National Congress. He himself has spent time in prison and being under house arrest. Ebrahim Rasool has built up extensive experience in government, having led many departments including health, welfare, finance, and economic development. As Premier of the Western Cape, he was instrumental in attracting foreign investment into the province. He has been ambassador to Washington.
Of your individuality to build community. That you must admit a degree of fragility and vulnerability in order to allow others also into your life and to be able to see the vulnerability and the fragility of others as well. And that's the basis of a great empathy that transcends everything that you stand for, everywhere that you come from, and the people that you call your community. And it's only that can shape the kind of insights that Nelson Mandela shared with us, both when he spoke to the press club here in 1994, as well as the story of the Rugby World Cup. And it is that I think makes us fairly unique as we go forward. You see, when we all have bonds, but those bonds that we have comes easily in a family, because we know every dream and help its realization of every other family member. We know every fear of every family member and we help them overcome it. It's very easy to have bonds within a community of people who look like you, think like you, talk like you, eat like you, pray like you, and do the things that you generally do. Because you share a heritage, you all know where you come from, and you share values which you express in your rituals, your culture, and your cuisine, and everything else. And so those bonds are the easy ones. But what do you do when you encounter the stranger? What do you do when you encounter the other? What do you do when, like Nelson Mandela, you encounter the enemy? Those who don't look like you, who don't pray like you, who don't think like you. What do you do when you confront them? When you don't know their dreams and their fears, when you don't share their heritage and their values. It's then to see behind them, within them, and beyond them. And that was the great contribution of Nelson Mandela, because Ubuntu is not just the way in which you are perceived. It is the way you also see others. It is the way you relate to others. Because then you have not sight, but insight. That's when you see that behind the aggression of those who have oppressed you may actually lie a deep fear of the unknown. Behind the arrogance may be a great vulnerability. Behind their military might is a great uncertainty. Behind their over-assertive religiosity is a deep spiritual vacuum. And he did not make a mistake of speaking to the aggression, to speaking to the arrogance, of speaking to the religiosity, of speaking to their might. If he did speak to all of those things,
For 2012, our marquee event is this evening's program, which we are going to begin with a performance of a traditional South African gumboot dance by the Taratibu Youth Association of Mount Rainier, Maryland, who will simultaneously sing as an a cappella group a traditional South African work song, Shosholoza, and a spiritual song, Yonolo Pata. Ladies and gentlemen, the Taratibu Youth Association troupe.
David, will you please stand and be acknowledged? David, very good. Actually, David, just come up here for a minute. Just come up here. Yeah. I'm also calling up the next person, so I'd like you both up here. And the man whom you just saw present the traditional NPC coffee mug to President Mandela, Gil Klein. The 1994 President of the National Press Club. Gil, could you just step up to the microphone, please? David contacted me as soon as he heard about it. He still has one of his proudest mementos of that day, showing him and Gil Klein with Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela has not aged. These two a little bit. Gil, in 2 minutes, we're on a tight schedule. Can you recall for everyone here what that day was like? As NPC president, you would have hosted many guest speakers that year. What are your memories of President Mandela's appearance? And how does that day fit into your own long and distinguished career as a journalist? And you do have a distinguished career. He was concerned whether I should use that adjective. Please, Gil.
Thank you very much, Myron. Two things stand out about that day. First of all, October 7th, the speaker that was lined up
since August 2010. We are pleased to welcome Ambassador Rasool as our keynote speaker this evening. Thank you. And I have one more sentence. And in doing so, I would like to thank the ambassador and his staff for their enthusiastic support and encouragement to this evening's program. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Myron Belkent, and thank you very much to the National Press Club for this extraordinary South African evening to celebrate the life, legacy, and values of Nelson Mandela. I think that it is a reunion of sorts in many ways. I remember the dark emergency in 1986, when in 1987 I went to prison for my second time, and our lawyers had tried to appeal, amongst others, to the Ambassador of the United States, who happened to be the first black ambassador, Edward Perkins. And thank you very much. And courageous journalism by people like Philip van Niekerk in what became the Mail and Guardian. I think it still sets the standards for bravery in journalism. It sets the bar for what is mischief in journalism and what is really true, courageous reporting on what happens, because the costs were just so many to be on the other side of the line. And so I think it's wonderful that that you're here. And then Charlene Smith, who I think has in the last few months taken the US by storm with her writing, with her enthusiasm for South Africa, and really in this seminal year making South Africa resound across the USA. Myron, you're right, in 1962 I was born as Nelson Mandela started his term in prison. In 1976 I went to high school and got caught up in the uprisings of the students, and then learned for the first time the name Nelson Mandela. It was in 1987 when I met Nelson Mandela for the first time, when a warden told me that I was ill, which evidently I wasn't, but it was his way of getting me into the same hospital waiting room at Pollsmoor Prison. And inside it was only Nelson Mandela and myself. And we had 10 minutes together. I just, incidentally, he was very worried about the young political detainees who were with me, and said, you know, I get a movie every Friday night. I'll insist with the wardens that he sends it to all of you to watch it on the Saturday night with my projector. We thought we were going to watch Police Academy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And we ended up watching with Nelson Mandela 12 episodes of a series called The Peopling of America. The history of the Native Americans, the slave history, where the Irish came from and where they settled, when the Italians came, when the Dutch came, and how it became a united nation. I think that in 1990, I had the opportunity to travel with him through Africa as he went through 13 countries, and I happened to ask him, what was the thing about watching that? And he was very aware of the fact that we were needing to unite our people, and we needed to learn from countries like the United States about how that was done. It was in 1994 that I understood that he had a unique contribution not only to South Africa, but to the world. And it was a unique contribution that was based on both that inner calm, but a radiating philosophy, a philosophy that we call Ubuntu, that in the words of Nelson Mandela says, I am because you are. That establishes not the independence of people, but the interdependence of people. Not the disconnectedness of people, but the interconnectedness of people. That we are people through other people. We do have responsibilities to each other and rights over each other, even while we are unique human beings ourselves. And so that really was one of the striking ways in which Nelson Mandela shaped South Africa's history and made an impact on the world. Just to continue with the dates, it was in 2006 when I was Premier or Governor of the Western Cape, and I had a visitor, an unknown senator from Illinois, who came visiting South Africa. Not many doors, political doors opened for him. I was one of 2 politicians who made time for him, spent 2.5 hours with him, and gave him one of the original lithographs of Nelson Mandela's first speech as a gift, When I presented my credentials to then President Obama, I reminded him of this picture, and he sent one of his guards out to ask me about the description of it because he was sure they had not brought it to the White House yet. I hope they have since, and especially now that he knows he's got the White House for another 4 years, he can decorate it. But this philosophy that Nelson Mandela lived by requires, unlike what we sometimes encounter in conversations, whether you're watching those conversations in the USA or whether you're participating in those conversations, it requires not that you hold on to your autonomy, but you understand that you cede some of your autonomy, both as a person and as a group and as a community. That you sacrifice some